Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Hello to all of you in New York and those of you participating through Zoom. I'm not sure what time zones all of you are in, but I especially want to thank those of you who are staying up very late or have gotten up very early in order to listen to this talk. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and thank you to the Association of Art Museum Curators for asking me to present this keynote. I was very honored to have been asked, and I especially want to thank Judith Pinheiro and Lucy Lydon for all of their assistance in planning this presentation. Next slide, please. I'm speaking today from Washington, D.C., which shares borders with Maryland and Virginia and connects with lands along the Anacostia and Potomac rivers. These river systems are where the Piscataway, the Powhatan, and at least 6 other indigenous cultures thrived. According to the National Park Service, the region was rich in natural resources and supported the local native people. After the arrival of the Europeans just 40 years later, there were only a quarter of the original occupants remaining. We acknowledge these people's stewardship of the land, as well as the extremely violent and disruptive impact of colonization on these peoples, their land, and cultures. Next slide, please. Bell Hooks, the writer, feminist, and activist, passed away in December of 2021. She wrote a great deal about love, and at the time of her death, there was quite a bit of coverage of her writing. When I saw this quotation, I thought, this is something that the Empathetic Museum believes also, and I must use this quotation in my talk. Next slide. Because we do believe that empathy is an action, never simply a feeling. Since our beginnings in 2012, 2013, we've had a lot of pushback from people who say empathy is soft or it's weak and sentimental. And we've also had a number of critics write that institutions in themselves cannot be empathetic, that they're just not made that way. So we have had to insist and persist in saying that empathy is an action. And today I'd like to talk, first of all, a little bit about the origins of the Empathetic Museum, and then provide some examples of actions that museums can take toward empathetic practice. Next slide, please. We're a group of 9 museum professionals. Our numbers have gone up and down over the years, but we're women and men. We are multiracial and multi-generational. Some of us are independent consultants, and some of us work full-time in various nonprofit institutions and museums. We're deeply connected to the recent history of the United States, especially concerning racism. I'd also like to point out one other museum initiative, and that is, and it's around empathy. There are a number of groups that speak about empathy as something that museums can teach, and they talk about the effectiveness of museums in teaching empathy to others. And of course, we certainly support and encourage this, but I just want to make the distinction that we are looking more at the institution rather than what it can teach others. And we're saying that the institution itself must exemplify empathy before it can really authentically teach visitors to be empathetic. We've developed a set of criteria and a rubric of progressive steps to guide museums to empathetic work. Next slide, please. I'd like to place our origins in the context of 3 of many stories that I could tell, and also 2 types of response. I began writing about empathy in museums in my blog, Museum Commons, in the spring of 2012. And that spring, Trayvon Martin, a young unarmed Black man, was killed in his community in Florida. There was 24/7 coverage on every type of media, as you may recall. And I was a new Twitter user. I was following mostly museums and museum personnel. And what I began to see is that in my Twitter feed, Trayvon Martin simply did not exist. So I began looking for how museums did or did not engage with various social and public crises. In the fall of 2012, Hurricane Sandy swept up the Atlantic coast. Mostly museums stated on their websites, they talked about their conditions, whether they themselves were safe, their buildings were safe, their collections were safe, and power was turned on. But they did not say very much about the communities around them. Mostly they said will be closed until further notice. Libraries, however, were quite different. The New York Public Library tweeted almost immediately that once each branch opened up and received power, that anyone in the area was welcome to come in, to get warm, to get bottled water. Now, none of this is the true mission of a library, but libraries looked at the desolation around them, at people who were cold and without electricity and power, and they invited them in, and they extended their empathy as an institution to their communities. In August of 2014, Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri. And you may remember that there was not only outrage in Ferguson and across the nation, but really around the world. Once again, mainstream museums tended to be silent. The exception were Black-led organizations. The Association of African American Museums placed a message of condolence on its webpage to the families of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and Trayvon Martin. And the association asked its member museums to use their collections and their programs in order to provide context and understanding. Melanie Adams, who is a museum professional, an African-American museum professional, was at the time the president of the Midwest Museums Association. She put a notice on their website and was also able to develop an extremely important town meeting, which I'll talk about a little bit later, at the Missouri History Museum, which was very close to Ferguson. I began to think, if it's right for the Association of African American Museums to make a statement of condolence, then the American Alliance of Museums and other museums and museum associations should do something of the same thing. These are not their children. These are our children who are being killed. These issues affect us universally. They're not the responsibility of a single segment of the population, even if they are the ones most directly affected. So the word empathy kept coming to mind, and I began posting, as I said, on Museum Commons and asking the question, why did mainstream museums, with very few exceptions, not have this empathy, this resonance with their communities? Next slide, please. Today, we've developed into an organization that provides training and workshops and materials to museums that wish to develop their empathetic practice. We believe very much that your current status embodies your history, your social and economic origins. So if your museum was located in an area governed by Jim Crow, and if you were segregated during that period, this is something that is part of your current history. If your museum was founded with funds that came from the slave trade, even though that was 100 years ago or more, this is still part of your current presentation of yourself to your community. We also believe that it's a deficit, a lack of institutional empathy, a presence of institutional indifference that inhibits and weakens your efforts at diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. So we believe in the strong connection between empathetic empathy and between institutional empathy and efforts of museums to achieve diversity and inclusion. Next slide, please. I'd like to focus a little bit more on the word empathy. If we could go to the next slide, please. We've always used this very standard Webster's definition because we feel and we find that with our participants, generally people talk about standing in someone else's shoes or vicariously experiencing the feelings of others. So we feel that the definition serves us well, but I'd like to point out just a couple of interesting things about this definition. First of all, Webster's does say that empathy is an action. We know that it's difficult to vicariously experience something that you've never experienced before, but Harvard psychologist and educator Richard Weisbord says that empathy can be learned and nourished. You're not just born with it. It's not a case of you either have it or you don't. Empathy is like a muscle. It can develop and grow through exercise. We can learn about the experiences of others, even though they're not part of our own past. And through repetition, we can respond with greater resonance to the feelings and thoughts and situations of others. The definition also says that empathy should not need the feelings of others to be communicated directly. There's an intuitive aspect to empathy, and this comes from learning about the lives and experiences of others. And we feel that this is the crux of our teaching. We can't depend on others to tell us what they need. Museums must be attuned to their communities, their needs, wants, and issues, and work to address them without being asked. Next slide, please. So the Empathetic Museum, the core idea is that it's an extended metaphor, and it's a familiar metaphor. We often use the concept of a person when we're talking about an institution. We say that the director is the head, or we talk about our educational arm, or we say that our mission or our collection is the heart and soul of our institution. The term empathy then connotes that a museum is a kind of living entity. It's capable of expressing itself to the world through its buildings, its activities, its exhibitions, and the general way that it behaves toward and with its public. But how do we do this? We say that empathy is action, but what do we mean by that? Next slide, please. We believe that an empathetic museum has 5 characteristics pictured on this graphic. First of all, a museum must have civic vision. It has to see itself as part of the civic infrastructure, as an anchor institution. A museum must be aware of how it communicates powerfully and non-verbally to its audience. A museum must connect authentically with its community and must respond to social issues in an appropriate and timely way, not in a reactive and one-off kind of situation. There must be sustained connection. And finally, we all must continually measure performance. Next slide, please. We've transformed the graphic that you saw in the previous slide into what is known as a maturity model. A maturity model is a tool that many organizations use to state specifically what their goals are. And you see that our goals, the characteristic of an empathetic museum, run down the left-hand side of this chart. And then the maturity model plots different steps that an institution can take from regressive or a very poor performance up to proactive. I know this chart with lots of colors and rectangles is a bit overwhelming, so I'm going to ask you just for a moment, and I'm sorry that we can't do this as a discussion, but ask each one of you, either in the auditorium in New York or on Zoom, to think of a museum that you know well. Either you work there or you have some other connection, and pick just one of the characteristics. civic vision or community resonance, and then try to place your museum in that in the rectangle with regard to community resonance. Where does the museum stand? I'm just going to give you a few minutes to do this, and no fair working on your Wordle or your spelling bee during this time. These are puzzles that I know a lot of people love to do, especially on Sundays. So please think about your institution and place it in the chart, and I'll leave you just a minute or so to do this. Okay, I hope you've been able to engage a bit mentally with the model. Next slide, please. So now that you've had a chance to think about a museum in terms of a specific characteristic, I'd like to talk a little bit about some examples of each of the characteristics. Next slide, please. So the first characteristic of an empathetic museum is civic vision, the ability of the museum to really see itself as part of the community and as I said, an anchor institution, part of the civic infrastructure. Here's a very, very current example. The Warsaw Museum of Modern Art has transformed itself in order to aid Ukrainian refugees. If you think of all of the organizations that are already present in Poland and in other countries along the border, you could say that the museum might think, well, there are plenty of people doing this. There's no need for the museum to really think about Ukrainian refugees. The museum, however, saw a certain responsibility, it seems, to look at what was going on in the city and to address it. So they're providing food and medicine to Ukrainian refugees. They're helping with documentation. They are having programs in Ukrainian. They have children's activities and adults activities. And it seems to me that a museum like this will never really be the same. If anything ever does go back to normal in Warsaw and at the museum, I think the museum will be transformed. We've found this with other museums that have really moved into the practice of civic vision. And you can find some other examples, primarily examples from the United States and Canada, on our website of museums that have really taken hold of civic vision in their work. Next slide, please. A second characteristic of the Empathetic Museum is institutional body language, and it's really analogous to our experience of personal body language. We all know that sometimes a gesture or a facial expression or a movement can be much more powerful than anything that we say. So the institution, I believe, can express itself in a very powerful way in a number of actions that are part of museum practice. In this example, these two examples, I'd like to talk about how the museum embodies empathy through choices about collecting, exhibiting, and interpreting. And the aspect of institutional body language I want to talk about is the oblivious display of powerful cultural symbols. On the left, you have a poster that's in the Smithsonian collections. We know that Klan materials are in many museums around the country. It's my belief and experience that white artists, exhibit designers, and curators are not fully aware of the violent and hurtful messages that these seemingly inert materials convey. And I have two examples of my own experience. In one instance, there was a full-size mannequin with Klan robe and hood standing on a pedestal at the entrance to an exhibition about Brown versus Board of Education. And you really couldn't get into the exhibition without passing under the gaze of this figure. In another instance, there was a museum of Southern history and culture that had a large light panel on its facade that showed a Klan rally. In both of these instances, the white curators, I'm sure, placed these symbols at the front in order to say there's something about the Klan on the inside in this exhibition or in this museum. But Black employees and visitors were shocked and offended at the pride of place given to these symbols of violence. As you know, many Black people in the country have their own personal and family histories of terrible effects of the work of the Klan. Many of the Black visitors and also staff members, security guards and so forth, said they could not and would not enter the exhibition or the museum in the presence of these traumatic symbols. So I think this is a good example of what we said in our definition of empathy, that it's important to learn about the different experiences of others and internalize that. I believe that Black curators or administrators would have understood the power of these images, and they wouldn't necessarily have eliminated their use, but they would have displayed them in a more sensitive manner. On the right, you have an example of a Benin bronze, the sculpture of the Oba of Benin. We know that the Benin bronzes are the pride of many museum collections around the world. They're beautiful examples of superb craftsmanship, and many museums display them in order to appear more Afrocentric and to counteract negative stereotypes of African peoples and cultures. This seems to be the reasoning behind the current exhibition at the Met, which is entitled The African Origins of Civilization. Many museums fail to be aware, however, that there is irony and hypocrisy in using objects that were stolen through colonization to highlight and display the cultures of the people who made them. And people from formerly colonized nations do not appreciate these displays nor see them as Afrocentric. Museums rarely make public that these objects were stolen. Often the label copy talks about them being collected, but they were looted by the thousands by the British Expeditionary Naval Force in the conquest and massacre of the Kingdom of Benin in 1897. And this is often referred to as the sack of Benin. Thousands and thousands of these sculptures were taken. Some of them were brought to British institutions. Many were simply taken by soldiers and sailors who were on the scene. They were brought home to private collections and later perhaps sold to museums or galleries. Those of us who are not from Nigeria and who don't know the full story behind these objects fail to see that these sculptures are stained with blood and that they emanate violence. The blood and the dirt have been washed off, but the emanation remains. You may know that there's a growing worldwide movement to return the bronzes to Nigeria. If your museum holds any of the Benin bronzes, this is part of your institutional body language. No matter if you attained them or obtained them legally from a prior owner, there's the stain of the origin that remains. How you acquired these objects, how you display them, and what you say about them and do about them in terms of restitution or arranging loan agreements, all of this is part of your institutional body language. Next slide, please. A third characteristic of an empathetic museum is community resonance. And there are two aspects to this. Here I'm going to talk a little bit about the external aspect of community resonance, how the museum values, relates to, and serves its diverse communities. Just as an empathetic individual resonates with the thoughts and feelings of others, a museum should be so connected with its community, as we said before, that they don't necessarily have to be told that the community is suffering or in crisis. The photo that you see on the right is a picture of the audience at the town meeting that the Missouri History Museum organized under educator Melanie Adams on the evening of the day of Michael Brown's funeral in August of 2014. The speed with which the museum was able to pull together a compassionate event, and I was able to watch it. It was broadcast nationally. It went on for about 3 hours. It featured a skilled moderator, powerful speakers, some of them local pastors, and outpourings of song and testimony from the audience. People could come up and take the mic and talk about their own feelings and experiences regarding the events around Ferguson, which was just down the street. So this, I think, is a very useful example of the ways in which a museum, which already had connections with the community in Ferguson, was able to address the suffering of the community at that time. Next slide, please. There's also an internal aspect to community resonance. In recent years, especially I think since the Association of Art Museum Directors published the study that it commissioned in 2015 from the Mellon Foundation on the demographics of museum staff. And it was discovered that there were very few people of color in positions of power, in authoritative positions, hired as curators. So museums have hired more people of color in curatorial and other top level positions. But the question is, what is their experience after hiring? Are they the only ones in their department or at their level? And does this place undue pressure on them? I have several examples that I want to talk about very briefly that talk about some of the issues that happen when you hire, but then don't necessarily build the empathetic systems within to support the people that you've hired. In 2020, and I'm sure this was also exacerbated by the pandemic, you had the very public resignations of a number of curators of color. Dr. Kelly Morgan, who was curator at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and Andrea Montiel de Schumann, who's pictured here, who was a digital artist at the Detroit Institute of Art. And both of these women talked very publicly about the injury to their mental and physical health as they worked at the museum. Their testimony is echoed in the Instagram account called Change the Museum, where you have hundreds of anonymous comments from people who work in museums from all over the world. And many of these are people of color and share some of the same issues as the two curators that I've mentioned. Finally, there's a study called The Burden We Carry. This was a doctoral dissertation done by Dr. Chris Taylor, who works on diversity right now for the state of Minnesota. He interviewed, this was before the pandemic, he interviewed 39 museum professionals of color who worked primarily in what he called white spaces. These curators and other museum professionals, again, talked about alienation. They talked about feeling excluded. They talked about feeling that the burden of diversity somehow was shifted to them instead of being shared by the whole institution. And another idea about the burden in the title, The Burden We Carry, is that many of these folks felt a strong feeling of anxiety in having to choose between leaving for their own health or staying, which they very much wanted to do in order to work on questions of diversity and inclusion. These three pieces of evidence show us that when we bring people who do not fit the norm whether they are from the LGBT community, whether they are people of color, whether it's a group of women in an institution dominated by men. We can't expect to continue business as usual. People with different life experiences will have different perspectives and they will ask different questions. I think this may, I don't really know the inside story, but this may be part of the issue at Montpelier, the home of James Madison right now, in that the board brought in and gave parity to the Descendants Committee, and then I think somehow felt that it could just go back and continue business as usual. An institution really needs to expand and adapt when it brings in people with very, very different life experiences. Those of us who are in a position of authority, in a position to hire and create good working conditions within our institutions, we have to consider the extra burdens carried by those who do not fit the norm. We have to develop systems that encourage them to feel welcome, heard, and encouraged to grow. Next slide, please. Timeliness and sustainability and performance measures are two other characteristics of the Empathetic Museum. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these two. You can find a lot of information and also case studies on our website that can provide examples of both of these characteristics. Next slide, please. We don't want to minimize the work that's required in order to develop into an empathetic institution. And we know that the maturity model can run the risk of oversimplifying the very, very difficult work of change. It's important for you to identify for each of the characteristics where you are on the rubric, to set priorities and get buy-in, to implement change, and then to evaluate your progress. And we know that museum time is a very slow-moving process, and that the internal process of change is really an ongoing process. It's never truly over. Next slide, please. So to move toward conclusion, these are a number of actions that a museum can take in order to create the kinds of systems that will underlie empathetic practice. You need to organize the institution as a place of equity for staff and welcome for visitors, to provide safety for both staff and visitors, to listen and respond to the accounts of staff as well as visitors, to consult on the use of unfamiliar cultural symbols and objects, to foster community relations and connections, to respond authentically and appropriately, and to research the latest studies on cultural participation. Next slide, please. The theme of this conference is sustainability and revitalization. And in my view, this work really has to be undergirded by institutional empathy. This is how you will move forward. I ask that you join us now in advocating and working for institutional empathy at your own organization. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
So thank you, Gretchen. That was a wonderful conversation, and we're going to have a brief Q&A. For those of you in the room, there's this mic here to my right. You can get up and ask a question. I have the first question from our virtual audience. Forgive me, my arms aren't long enough anymore. Gretchen, could you share a bit, how someone that is working at a museum, is an emerging curator, is younger on the staff, can really encourage and advocate for their museum to become more empathetic internally and not just focus on that conversation externally?
Sure, this is a question that we get often. I think, first of all, it's important to work with others. In other words, don't feel that you have to do this by yourself. I think find allies depending on your position. I find often people in the education level, which can sometimes be not as powerful in the museum, that people at the education level need to find allies. First of all, perhaps your director of education, if that's someone who sits, for example, on the director's committee. So I would find allies. I would talk at your level. You could use the rubric. You can print out the rubric from our website and talk about it with your colleagues, and then talk about how you might bring that up the chain of command, for example, if you don't have immediate access to the director. Another thing that I've had some people talk about is one museum was going to be celebrating its 50th anniversary, and 50 years ago it actually had been segregated and had been not a very welcoming place. And so they decided to use the Empathetic Museum rubric as a way to examine their history, and then to use that when they developed programs around their history for the anniversary. So those are just a couple of things, but it is difficult to make progress in that.
Thank you. And are there any questions from the room? Well, thank you, Gretchen, so much for joining us virtually.